let's get started. So welcome everyone to day 4 of the African Languages Conference. Today we're going to have a panel discussion led by, from my notes here, I've got Josephine. So hopefully it's still the same person. If it's Kate, I apologize. Excuse me. So today's session, before I get started on today's session, I'd like to introduce myself and introduce the speakers as well. So my name is Avishta. I'm one of the co-producers of African Languages Conference, and I would like to share a little bit of the conference. If this is the first time you're joining us for the conference, I'd like to bring some context in. So the African Languages Conference 2024 is being organized by Adi Namaran Coulibaly from Bilingual Consult, me representing the Lingua Cultura Experience and Cultura Connector, and Christian Elonge from the Cabot Group. This event is being sponsored by Hybrid Links and is also being supported by ACALAN, the African Academy of Languages. The conference serves as a pivotal platform for language activists, scholars, linguists, educators, and enthusiasts to converge, exchange ideas, and foster collaborations aimed at promoting the rich tapestry of African languages. This edition of the conference is focused on the theme of African languages, challenges, and opportunities. If you've been joining us over the last couple of days, you may have noticed that the majority of our sessions are actually being hosted in African languages, including Wolof, Zulu or isiZulu, Twi, Hausa, Yoruba, Kiswahili, Shen, Igbo, Nigerian Pidgin English, French, English, and many more. So for today's session, we're going to focus the conversation on multilingual education across Africa. Just to give you a little bit of information about the session itself, African children are overwhelmingly taught in a language they do not speak at home. The presentation provides an overview of the language of instruction policies in Africa and examines the extent to which the continent is addressing its linguistic diversity with reference to case studies shared by policymakers from Mozambique and Côte d'Ivoire. So based on my notes here, I've got the moderator, as I mentioned before, is Josephine Kiyenje, I hope. From Global Education Monitoring Report from UNESCO. And the speakers are Ingrid, Barbara, Dr. Carlos, and Eduardo. So I hope these are still the individuals who are joining us today. If not, I apologize. Please do introduce yourselves, and over to the moderator. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us join the African Languages Conference. We're excited to be here. My name is Josephine Kiyenje. I'm from the Global Education Monitoring Report, where I lead the Spotlight series. Today's panel is made up of distinguished educational researchers. And before we start the session, I would like to encourage those of you attendees to, as we go through the presentations, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat so that we can address them through a Q&A at the end of the session. As we start out, I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in the order that we are going to present. Ingrid, please go ahead.
Oh dear. Hi, Joe. Sorry. This is Ingrid coming to you from South Africa. We at the moment have load shedding, and 6 o'clock started and our lights just went out, but I've got the backup. So here I am. Thank you so much to Joe for inviting me to share on the panel. I was privileged to participate in the Spotlight study, but as Joe has found out because we've chatted, I've also done research in the multilingual support in our country, and I'm very happy to share some of that knowledge and information with you. Thank you, Joe.
Barbara? Go ahead.
Yes, hello. My name is Barbara Trudell, and I don't know if my camera is meant to be on or not, but yeah, I'm a senior consultant for language and learning with SIL Africa Learning and Development, which is a consultant unit that does advocacy work on behalf of the use of African languages by the African language communities who speak them, whether for educational or other purposes. I have spent most of my life living in Africa, and my research recently has had to do with language policy, formulation, implementation, the impact of different policies on student learning. And I've done research in a number of countries across the African continent in that space. And I'm very pleased to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. We're pleased to have you. Ingrid, we're really pleased to have collaborated with you on the South Africa Spotlight Report. Carlos, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carlos. I'm from Mozambique. I'm a linguist, actually, educational linguistics. I have done a lot of work in bilingual education in Mozambique, looking at policy and practices. My interest, in addition to bilingual education, includes also early literacy and language processing, particularly in reading. Currently, I'm part of a team dealing with language of instruction across Africa, not really the whole Africa, but some African countries and the Philippines. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Helen, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Helen from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. I am an applied linguist, and I have been researching on multilingual education across Africa. But my most recent activity, I am in partnership with Carlos, who is here as well. We are looking at language of instruction, transition in education systems across different countries, including Mozambique, Rwanda, Senegal, Kenya, and the Philippines, as he has already pointed out. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
I will go ahead and start with an overview of the Spotlight project and what it is, and some of the evidence that we've synthesized on this issue across Africa. I'm going to share my screen. Just one second. And please, I didn't have a chance to say this, but for those of you attendees, please go ahead and share in the chat, where you're connecting from, your email address, or anything else you'd like us to know about yourself, because we'd love to stay connected with you as we look to expand the community of those interested in this issue across Africa. So, okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Education Monitoring Report, the Global Education Monitoring Report is hosted by UNESCO. It's an independent unit, and its function is to monitor progress and implementation on SDG 4. You may be familiar with the SDG 4 benchmarks. There's 7 of them. The Spotlight series looks at 3 of these benchmarks. It looks at out of school completion and, of course, learning proficiency. And why is this issue? The Spotlight focuses on Africa, while the Global Education Monitoring Report has a global report for Africa. Its regional report focuses only on foundational learning, and basic education completion. The reason we've picked this theme for Africa is really based on the data. You'll see where learning is in terms, here this shows learning in terms of literacy, and where we need it to be in terms of benchmarks. And those benchmarks are set by countries. And so this is where countries are, and this is where, and the dotted line is where they wish to be towards this SDG 4 benchmark. So, you know, there's need to transform education, and in part by addressing this issue of language. So the series itself is a partnership, and it's a partnership between the Global Education Monitoring Report, ADEA, which is the Association for Education Development in Africa, and the African Union. It also partners with countries at country level. And in the first year of the report, we partnered with 5 countries and produced in-depth reports, just as we've done this year with 5 different countries. And we also partner with academic researchers, and some of the researchers are on this call, including Ingrid and Rolene, and civil society and local education groups, because the idea is that the evidence from the country reports should then feed into policy dialogue. Just to give you a sense of the scope, these are the countries from the first cycle, and these are the countries from the second cycle. Along with the detailed country reports, we also work with education researchers to produce case studies. So each year we cover about 12 countries. I'm not going to go through the analytical framework just because I want to get to the presentations from the panelists, but this is just to give you a sense of what the analytical framework looks at. For the first year, we looked at all 7 factors. For this next round, we will look at 3 factors, basically the content alignment with the content, the pedagogical alignment, and the political alignment to support numeracy across Africa. From the 2022 report, there were recommendations. So the report at the continental level draws from the evidence of the country reports, the evidence of the case studies, some background papers, our own GEM report analysis on different data, and it sort of culminated into recommendations that we drew from the evidence. So there were recommendations at these levels, at the student level, at the system level, at the continental level, and at the international level. Those 3 important recommendations at the student level. And one of the most sort of important recommendations is for governments to teach all children in their home language. It may seem obvious, but as I go through the next slides, you'll understand why it was important for us to emphasize this recommendation. Okay, so in terms of the evidence, so the report synthesizes evidence, and it synthesized evidence along all those recommendations. But the recommendations on home language instruction, we see that those who speak the language of instruction at home are more likely to achieve proficiency in foundational skills. And of course, given that they're more likely to achieve proficiency in foundational skills, then that impacts the probability of completing primary education. As well, the evidence is clear that you need at least 6 years of home language instructions in order to yield the long-term benefits. And in contexts where, under-resourced environments, the evidence points to a minimum of at least 8 years in order to achieve those long-term benefits. We also found that where there was data available in the 22 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, only a fifth of the students were taught in the language that they speak outside school. But again, we are optimistic, and we see that, if bilingual education is, developed for less than 3% of the countries spoken across sub-Saharan Africa, countries would be able to reach at least half the primary school age, which, estimates at about 86 million children. You'll see on the next slide the idea that the evidence that not speaking the language of instruction at home also adds to disadvantage to children who are already at risk of dropping out, at risk of not completing, at risk of not having the requisite skills to progress in their educational journeys. Despite all the evidence, I think this is the issue of concern, and this is why we're all connected here today, is that the idea of home language, or the importance of home language, while we see the clear evidence, it still remains neglected in national policies, and not just with national policies as well. We don't see that clear link to evidence in development partner interventions. And this is the graph that I was, referencing, the importance of addressing home language to support equity measures. You'll see that here in Cameroon, the 54% of children reached minimum proficiency in reading at the end of primary, but only 35% of children in rural areas did so, and then only 18% of children who did not speak the language of instruction reached that minimum level of proficiency. So you clearly see that there is a huge equity issue to be considered by education policy. The same findings are also true for Togo. And if we look at and we separate it between literacy and numeracy and the impacts of language and assessment, you'll also find that the percentage of children who are taking reading assessment and achieving minimum proficiency, those that do better are those that speak the language of the assessment at home, right? So children who do not speak the language of the assessment are disadvantaged. The same is also true for numeracy, and Ingrid will speak more to this and the lessons and share lessons from South Africa. But again, while there's clearly a challenge, and while there are huge gaps in addressing home language instruction, there are also positive practices that we, as education practitioners and different policymakers, can draw from. We find for the current Spotlight Report 2024 that 31 countries across Africa have adapted bilingual or multilingual education policies, and that they transition, many of them, introduce an early exit system. About 74% of these 31 countries introduce an early exit system. So an example of an early exit system is, in Malawi, the overwhelming language, about 50% of Malawians, is Chichewa. Instruction, there's instruction in Chichewa from grade 1 to grade 4. And English is one of the subjects at that level. And then from grade 5 until the end of primary, they switch to English instruction and then study Chichewa. In the Central African Republic, the government sort of reviewed their language policy, and they had been, language of instruction was strictly in French. and they revised their policy and switched to the predominant language, which is Sango, and introduced a pilot where they're introducing language of instruction in Sango for the first 2 grades, and then extending it alongside French until the end of primary education. We're looking forward to learning more from the results of that pilot. Niger as well has introduced bilingual education policy, and also partnered that or coupled that with teaching and learning materials for at least 5 out of 10 national languages in 500 schools. They're also assessing the effectiveness and scalability. Through the various presentations, you'll also hear some of the practices, including from Mozambique's bilingual education policy and its implementation from Carlos. And then from Roline will focus on the implications for assessment in South Africa. Barbara will share more of the evidence across Africa. But generally, through the Spotlight series and through working with the Association for the Development of Education in Africa and at the African Union level, we believe that there is room to enhance dialogue with policymakers at the African Union level so that we can learn together and we can learn from the positive practices of addressing this issue through policy measures and also understanding the implementation that countries have achieved. We've partnered with the African Union and as well with ADEA through a mechanism called LEARN, the Leveraging Education Analysis for Results Network. And through this network, we aim to enhance dialogue on the findings of the Spotlight reports, including on this issue of home language instruction. Thank you so much. I will then move to the next presentation, and I welcome all of you to join our campaign to ensure that all African children are born to learn. Thank you. I now invite the next presenter, Ingrid. As she mentioned, it's just been such a joy and pleasure to, I was always aware of her work that she's done with Funda Wande and some of the studies that she's written through WITS, but it was such a pleasure to partner with her as the lead researcher on the Spotlight South Africa report. Please go ahead, Ingrid.
Thank you, Jo. I just need to get the slideshow full. You can see my slides, right?
Yes, we can.
Right. Thank you very much. And thanks for that overview of the work that you've been doing across Africa. Very interesting to hear that. I'm now going to zoom in on South Africa, looking at language policy implementation and early grade numeracy in South Africa. And in my introduction, because I was a bit flustered because our power just went off, just to say I'm at the University of Witwatersrand and also working in a maths implementation program called Funda Wande. So first of all, just a bit of background in terms of policy, LTSM, which is what we talk about, learning and teaching support materials, and assessment, looking at some international literature and the South African context. First of all, our policy, which was promulgated in 1997, so quite a long time ago, promotes multilingualism. However, what we have is a bit of an issue on the ground because it's been interpreted in a way that isn't necessarily allowing multilingual speakers to use what we call the full language repertoire. So the Department of Basic Education has interpreted this LIEP, our Language in Education policy, as provision of education for all children in their mother tongue, but in a monolingual format. So schools choose what we call a LOLT, a language of learning and teaching. And then if you have chosen isiZulu as your LOLT of the school, then children officially are meant to be taught in isiZulu. Schools can choose up to 5 LOLTs And then they actually have to have parallel classes in which each of those languages are offered. So as you can imagine, there are not many where 5 languages would be chosen. There are some. There are many where 2 languages are chosen as LOLs, and then there are teachers teaching in those different languages. So multilingualism is seen as the provision of schooling across the country. So we are providing multilingual education. But what I'll be focusing on is an issue which I think all South Africans are aware of, and I've seen there a couple of fellow South Africans in the audience. Good to see you there, Fikile and Elvi. And yeah, this is an issue that we are addressing. So all of the materials are also provided in what we call a monolingual format. So our curriculum and assessment and policy statement, the CAPS, is written in all 11 official languages, but only in the one language. And there is a proviso in the inside cover of all of the African language curriculum statements that if there are errors found in this document, you should refer back to the English one from which this was translated. So the issue of translation and versioning and actually looking at the meaning of language in the context and across the different languages is still problematic. And that links to the standardization of language, which I'll also speak to a little bit later. So we have more monolingual text, and all of our tests also provided in all of the languages, but always monolingually. And the research has shown, I'll go to the next slide, that these texts, especially in a country like South Africa, which is multilingual, where the majority of people are speaking more than one language, an African mother tongue, and then often English. In the rural context, not as much, but the parents are wanting children to learn English, seen as the language of power. And so there's a lot of issues that come up around language use. So internationally and in South Africa, language is seen as a tool, especially in the teaching of mathematics. So I'm a maths expert. I've been in primary maths education for more than 30 years. It's my absolute passion that every child in our country should be able to do maths. And my interest in the multilingual context started most strongly in 2012 when I started working in a project that was looking at foundation phase. Became aware of the teachers who would be teaching in the LOLT because they'd been told to do so, and wanting to speak, obviously majority mother tongue, but wanting to switch to other languages where children might speak more than one language, or where particularly the language might not be, the words might not be developed. And so I started to research this and work with different groups of people to understand what was going on at a policy level on the ground and what we should do to support it. And as Joe has pointed out, it's well documented that children should be learning in their mother tongue in the early years. What we are seeing and what we're wanting to investigate more in our country is how mixed language can be used to support the learning of maths. Because in maths, we're aiming to learn the mathematical concepts. Although language, I mean, we use the language to express those ideas, there could very well be mixing of language while speaking about those in an expression of and a demonstration of your understanding of the concepts. So 2 forms of language mixing are spoken about most often. Those are code switching and translanguaging. And the way in which I have started to use these 2 is one that distinguishes between where you recognize that you're switching between languages, and that one I would speak as code switching, whereas translanguaging is the more fluid use of language, which is very, very
Ingrid,
commonly. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you put your slide, because I think that what you're presenting on the process of your approach, it's not projecting, and I think that that's a really useful
goodness.
to see it.
What? So you're not seeing my slides?
We see the cover slide, but I think now you must.
It hasn't moved.
Yes.
It's moved on my screen. What should I do, Joe?
Okay.
Yes, but what should I do?
Maybe just scroll down because
Okay.
there's a bar on the left-hand side, and scroll it down because I think you're presenting slide 5 now, right? Or because you speak clearly, I mean, and it's understood, maybe we can share your slides afterwards, or I can actually project for you. Let me
Yes,
pull
you
your
could
PowerPoint.
project for me, Joe. You could project, and then definitely you can share my slides afterwards. That would be absolutely fine.
Let me just give me a second
I'm
to
so
pull it up.
sorry because I wasn't aware of that.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you because you speak so clearly. It's very easy to follow. But then I thought we do want to see your approach. I'm just downloading it. Give me a moment.
So I could just carry on speaking, Joe, and then when the slides
Yeah, you
pop
can
up,
carry on
how
speaking.
about that?
Tell me what slide
Okay.
you're at.
Okay. I was rambling a bit, I suppose one could say, because the slides are connected. I was getting towards the end of the second slide only. And there's an important quote at the bottom of that one, just in terms of linking this work to your work and the goal achievement of SDG 4. I found a lovely paper written by a Stellenbosch University academic that was published yesterday or the day before, because of it being African Languages Week, speaking about the importance of allowing the multilingual repertoire to be used and seeing it as not just a move towards inclusivity, but also kind of a move away from colonialism and the languages of authority and power, recognizing the value and the importance of the mother tongue, all of our languages, and the mix of those languages, and seeing that as a way in which we can enable children in our country to achieve their full learning potential. So then we can go to slide 4, Joe, and that just wraps up what I've been speaking about.
Is that slide 4?
Wait. No, that slide. Oh, I don't know. The one, but yeah, no, the one. Yes, this one. So here's a quick summary for those who haven't been seeing my slides. We have our policy. It does support multilingualism, but what happens is in the interpretation, I'm sorry about that spelling error, I had corrected it on my side. Monolingual materials are produced and monolingual LOLs are supported. So we see a system of multiple monolingualism, a phrase that I've coined with Tony Estienne, who was my supervisor for my PhD, in which I worked in this field and have published a bit after that. And yeah, it's been fantastic working with him. So what I then want to move on to now is that what the things that impact language use are language ideologies. So whether we like it or not, or whether we are aware of it or not, ideology does actually influence the way we use language. And the two main drivers are the monoglossic and the heteroglossic ideologies. And I mean, clearly monoglossic is going to be pushing towards monolingualism and purist language use, the use of one language only, and then heteroglossic pushing more towards the pluralist language use or language mixing. So with this background, our context, our policy context, the kind of complication in the way in which it's applied, and then these ideologies, what are we seeing? How do people use language and what works? And that's what I'll be speaking about. So in the next slide, Joe, you can move on to the next one. There is a complex analytical framework that I developed for looking at actual language use. So my study looked at really an on-the-ground study of the way in which teachers were using language and looking at the drivers being ideology. And in addition to that, research seen as an authority and policy seen as authority, but showing also how research and policy are not actually exempt from being influenced by ideology. So everything almost is actually being influenced by ideology. Then within that, the different forms and ways in which it can be, the monoglossic and heteroglossic, And just important, I think, for people to think about, because I've got a lot to say and it can't go into everything in enough depth in the time that we have, is that the ideology would either be embodied or articulated. So people are not always aware of these ideologies. At times they actually articulate them and they can understand, or they are aware of what they believe about language use, the ideology that they're enacting. At other times, I or you watching the way in which a person is using language could infer an ideology, and that would then be called, in terms of literature, an embodied ideology. Then down on the ground, the practice, obviously there's huge variation, and I categorized different language uses in different schools in terms of categories and subcategories, looking at all the different ways in which language is used and spoken in a maths classroom. And so there's this enormous variation, and one of the things that actually then limits the variation at times, and at other times, and that's the irony of it, actually promotes the variation, is this issue of standardization of languages. So in South Africa, our African languages are not all fully standardized yet, and there are people who could also answer questions about this if there would be time afterwards. But one of the issues and one of the ideas spoken about teachers in terms of language use when they speak about math teaching is that some words don't exist necessarily. So then they might make up a word or use an English word, and then there are their different ideologies which would either push them not to do that or to do that or to be confused about it, especially when policy is at the top of their minds, because most of our teachers are very compliant. They don't actually want to step out of line. And when they are being told that they have to use pure language, and then they don't have the languages, I've spoken to teachers who get very angry because they say, we are told not to use mixed languages, and then we are given texts in which anglicizations are used or are used. So what should we then do? Just some background then to a kind of an academic way of looking at language use in the context. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, Joe. Zooming in on the Spotlight study, where we went into, I can't remember how many schools, but quite a few schools. And there again, seeing the mixing of language use and the teachers also believing that mixing language promotes understanding. So a lot of our teachers don't speak about translanguaging because in South Africa, code switching has been spoken about much more, and it's understood to mean moving from one language to another, and the fluidity of it isn't necessarily clearly defined. But what we see on the ground is much more translanguaging. So teachers in the multilingual context having a language repertoire consisting of at least two and probably more than that languages, drawing on the different languages quite fluidly, often almost without thinking about it, and doing so because they believe that it promotes understanding. So to speak to the idea then of the policy of language, in our country we have mother tongue instruction until the end of grade 3. And then I always say miraculously, the children are able to start speaking English in grade 4. And then we see a huge drop in the results because obviously they don't. So one of the things which my work has promoted alongside many, many other studies is that bilingual material would be supportive of learning and would support the transition from mother tongue to English whenever that would happen. And so the bilingual material, we believe strongly, should be provided at least till the end of primary school education. Then we can go to the next slide, Joe. So looking at the policy and how teachers teach, one of the things we'd like to see is the teachers harnessing the power of language. And I think it's clear that I would say that we need to develop respect and appreciation for the multilingual repertoire. We need to support teachers in the use of a multilingual repertoire, which at least would mean give them bilingual materials. And then on the pedagogical side, looking at promoting teaching which is interactive, where the voices of both the teacher and the learner need to start coming through. In our classes, unfortunately, often learners are very passive. Teachers might, even in the primary school years, give a lesson, not really allow children to even open their mouths much, or they chorus their answers. They don't give thoughtful, extended, explanatory kind of answers. So we would be saying harnessing language means, as a teacher, model the language correctly in any language, and then get the learners to speak. And there as well, do not constrain the children. So if a child wants to answer in English, if it's a Sesotho Lal school, let them answer in English. Now, a teacher might want to do that, but I've had teachers who say to me, what should I do? Because I'm not meant to be allowing them to speak English. And if the child is unable to speak Sesotho because actually it's a Tswana or an isiXhosa speaker in a Sotho class because our classes are mixed, what am I meant to do? Obviously, I would say any language goes, and policy needs to reach that point. Okay, so the next slide, which I think is the last slide. Yes, we need to do further research, and in the program that I'm working, we're embarking on a new 3-year study looking not just at how do teachers use language, because I think we've done that quite a lot and we know that they mix it in various ways and so on. But what we're wanting to dig into, and teachers that we've spoken to have said, what is the best way to use language? If I'm teaching math, what is the best? And I have to say, well, I'm not quite sure in terms of studying because I haven't done this systematically yet myself. And so we'll be working in 30 schools and very, very closely with the teachers, looking at math teaching, but then looking at how you use language when you do this in the multilingual context. What kinds of mixing are supportive of learning and that kind of thing. So I've got more learning to do and hopefully can publish some of those findings so that we can all learn together. But the big thing is we need to be moving towards recognition of multilingual speakers and the value of drawing on the full language resource. And that's all. Thank you very much. And thanks, Joe, for your support with the slides.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Oh my goodness, there was so much in that rich presentation, and we definitely look forward to receiving and the findings of your research from those 30 schools and learning through that research. We hope to have you through one of the Learn sessions so that you can share that research with us.
Thanks, Joe. Would love that.
Now we're going to pivot to Barbara, who's going to be presenting from a continental perspective. Please go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, you're very clear.
I wonder if you could take this screen down and allow me to share my own screen then.
Yes. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right, I'm up then. Okay, just let me know. Can you see that all right? Am I doing okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to join you today. I just wanted to say to the participants, since 1993, I have lived in Kenya, I've lived in Cameroon, I've lived in South Africa, and I've done work as well in Senegal, Mozambique, and Nigeria. So I'm really happy to see who is on the call. I feel like, maybe we were neighbors at some point. It's hard to know. So I wanted to talk to you about language of instruction policy in Africa, the content of that policy and the impact. So kind of pulling back a bit from the specifics of one country. So national level language in education policy trends in Africa, what are they right now? What are they these days? I think we are seeing three major policy choices or directions. And the one policy choice is the use of an international language as the language of instruction from at least grade 1 onwards. And very often they actually begin in early childhood education in the international language. And so that will be in Africa, that will be French, it will be English, it will be Arabic, it will be Portuguese, it might be Spanish. So these international languages. Now, for political or historical reasons, you may see competition among international languages at the national level. For example, French versus English as the language of instruction. I think a good example there is the experience of Rwanda, which for many years, French was the language of instruction throughout. And now at this time, English is the language of instruction almost entirely throughout the education experience of the child, with the exception of the reading subject, which is in Kinyarwanda, which is the language that 96+% of the people speak. So French versus English in Rwanda. Arabic versus French, which you will see, as you know, in some of the countries further to the north of the continent, where the citizens in the northern parts of the country tend to speak more Arabic, and those in the south tend to speak more French. And so there's competition there. You will actually see this one in Sudan. Before South Sudan gained their independence, you had Arabic versus English. And that was a point of significant conflict. Portuguese versus English. I think you see this in some cases where the former Portuguese colonies that are now nations of their own, they're using Portuguese, but maybe some of their citizens and institutions are saying, oh, we should use English. So there may be competition, but nevertheless, the policy choice is an international language of instruction. Policy choice 2 is to choose a limited number of larger or more prestigious local or regional languages as languages of instruction. This is a very common policy model in Africa, as we know, and it allows the local or the regional language of instruction to be taught generally through grade 3, with then an international language of instruction from grade 4 onward. But there are many places where this is the policy model. And then there is a third choice in which the policy names all local or regional languages of instruction without naming any specific languages at all. You may see terminology such as national languages in the policy, or in Ethiopia's case, nationality languages. You may see langue nationale, Burkina Faso, some other places. So that's what I'm talking about there. They don't specify a language or languages. In Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, you will see language of the immediate environment or language of the catchment area, again, without naming any names. And in Senegal, their policy says any local language, since I believe 2001, any local language that has an approved orthography or writing system may be used as a language of instruction in the schools. So they basically say any language in our country may be used. That's what the policies are saying in those places. Now, again, the most common model then allows these languages to be used through grade 3 with an international language of instruction from grade 4. So those are the 3 major policy choices that you see if you survey language and education policy across the continent. Now, these policy choices may be influenced by a couple of things. They may be influenced by aspirations, national aspirations for change, or by the desire to keep status quo, to keep things the way they are and to strengthen the way things are. So aspirational language policy choices are basically based on looking forward to what do we want to become as a nation? What do we want to be? The challenge here is that they may not actually reflect current linguistic realities or current sociolinguistic realities. So you have a policy choice that in its aspirations for the future is not necessarily linking very well to the way things are now. Other language policy choices may reinforce existing educational planning and curriculum. So the curriculum is there, so the policy choices say, yes, we're going to support that, reinforce it with our language and education policy. But if the existing system is being carried out in a language that the children do not speak, we know that is also a problem. Looking at some trends across the continent in the choice of bilingual or multilingual models of education. The early exit language transition model is by far the most common multi-language learning policy being chosen in Africa. So basically, as you have heard, as you know, the early exit refers to using local languages of instruction usually through grade 3, sometimes grade 2, and then transitioning or moving away from that one and moving into an international language of instruction by the following grade, usually grade 4. Okay, so you move from you're using one language as medium of instruction, you stop, you move to another language as medium of instruction. That is the transition part. Okay, and it is very common. The late exit language transition model is much less common. It involves using local language of instruction through usually P6, or P5, quite late in primary school. And then the transition to the international language then happens in late primary or early secondary. Now, there are not very many places where this is the model. There are some few, but not very many. And then a third choice that you can see very, very occasionally is the language maintenance policy model. Now, this one is built on the assumption that we will never transition out of the child's own language. There is no transition. What we are doing is adding now, usually an international language of instruction, but not taking away the L1, the first language medium of instruction. And so as you reach towards the end of primary and even into secondary education, both languages are being used. And that is why this is called an additive model as well as a language maintenance policy model. These are rare. Usually you're finding these, I know you find them in Europe where both languages are quite strong and have a lot of prestige and power. So you can, for example, so English-speaking families in Canada, in Francophone Canada, will send their children to a French immersion school along with English because they know it's not going to be a problem. But these models are rare. So now then, looking at some implementation issues. These are some of my little friends in Kenya, by the way. So looking at implementation issues. Thinking about the politics of language and education policy in African nations, the reality is that the pedagogical rationale for many language and education policy decisions is quite limited. That is to say that pedagogy is not necessarily what they're thinking about when they make the policy, okay? Classroom pedagogy. Language and education policy choices may be more about global or local national identity. They may be about fitting in with some regional policy trends or gaining political leverage in the context where they are. All these can be reasons for language policy choices in schools. Also, when you have authorities who are in their positions for a limited term, they may want to make their mark on the policy arena while they are in office. And language and education policy statements may be seen as an easy, what I call political football. So, I mean, you know football, you kick it around here and there in another place. And it's easy to do that with language and education policy. And in fact, you might even ask the question, How often is implementation even the intention of the policy? I think often it is, but there are times that it is not. Implementation is not even in the plan. So for language and education policies that focus on local or regional languages, actual implementation of those policies may be limited. It may even be non-existent. And I think we all know of these kinds of situations. Often the policy as it is written is quite optimistic about what can happen compared to the national political will to change language of instruction or the resources that are available. And too often, policy work ends with publishing the policy document. And it's like, okay, we're finished. But there's not enough effort given to implementation activities. So when these things happen, the local policy decisions remain in force in the classrooms, regardless of the national language and education policy. As you can see in this lovely school here, the national policy in this place is language of the catchment area should be used in grades 1 through 3 as medium of instruction. But this is a local policy decision that has been made. Language and education policy implementation takes time, and it takes concerted effort and effort at multiple levels. There will always be those who gain by the policy and those who lose by the policy. It's just how it is. And this reality has to be negotiated very carefully. Advocacy, sensitization with the stakeholders are both crucial. And the policy implementation also has to be supported by either existing or new teaching and learning materials, by teacher capacity or capacity building, by school management, and many more things. There has to be support in the whole system for this policy implementation. And of course, resources for implementation must be carefully considered. So what might we see in the future in terms of language in education policy across Africa? I think we'll probably see these three things. We will see nations that are reassessing their language of instruction policy after the many early grade reading programs finish. So these internationally funded local language EGR programs, when they are done, I think we will see national leaders making their own decisions about ongoing language policy outcomes and the value and the cost of those outcomes. I think we will continue to see internal debates about language of instruction choices as the policy contestation continues between those who promote international languages of instruction and those who promote the local or national languages of instruction. You see it all the time. Whichever policy is in force, the guys on the other side are always yelling about it. So, and then when they get into force, when you start doing the other one, then the first guys yell. So it's very difficult to make everyone happy in your language of instruction policy. And I think these internal debates will continue. And then I think for sure, the ongoing importance of technical expertise to assist national leaders in the implementation of effective language and education policy choices. And my final thoughts are, when language and education policy does not have a strong legal foundation, it is vulnerable to the political climate, and it is also susceptible to sudden or frequent changes. This is bad for a policy, as you know. But including in this vulnerability, there are spaces for advocacy and action to make changes, and for marginalized African language communities to gain new access to learning opportunities for their children using the languages that those children speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for just giving us a lot to reflect upon and to better understand policy choices and the politics of language. We've seen it recently in countries like Zambia, where they're reversing with a new curriculum, multilingual education. So I think it's important for practitioners and those of us that are advocating for languages to have this broader picture, so that we're using these tools in our dialogue with countries.
Well, and in
thanks
fact,
so much.
in Zambia, that policy choice lasted 13 years, and that was it. No, 11 years. So
They keep changing it.
That was focusing on specific languages and early grade reading in this set of languages. Yeah. So if there's changes now, that's about what happens. So
I now invite Carlos to share the experience of bilingual education in Mozambique. I really do hope that we get time for conversation and questions at the end, simply because these presentations are so rich, and I'd like to engage with the audience. Please go ahead, Carlos.
Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see it, and you may want to put it in presenter mode.
Okay.
Or I can project for you if you want to start, and then I can project for you if it's easier.
Okay, please go ahead. Thank you.
Just give me a moment, but you can go ahead and start.
Well, I'm going to talk about bilingual education in Mozambique, and what I want to talk about particularly here are the opportunities and challenges of what I believe to be an inclusive approach to education in Mozambique. We had Barbara, Ingrid, and even Josephine when talking about language of instruction, the need to have children learn in the language they speak at home, not only because it's easy, but also because that brings along all the socialization aspects of their lives, all the content, all the learnings they have, which should be followed up in school, rather than disrupting or even discontinuing it. Let me present the context of Mozambique, which is a multilingual and as such a multicultural country, mainly with African languages in the country. And depending on whoever you will read, they will say there are between 20 and 40 languages. I might contend that the number might be around 20, whereas most of the other languages also said to be languages might be varieties of those 20 or so languages. And this calls for some studies to really identify whether we have those 20 or 40 or more languages, and particularly the relationships amongst those languages. But I believe that we are around 20 something languages, whereas all the others may be varieties. We have 19 languages with standardized orthographies. And this is a process that has been going on for the last 30, 40 years, where universities were at the forefront of the process. And interestingly, for this process, the community as a whole has been involved in working in those orthographies and I'm talking about not only universities, but ministries, particularly the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Culture, religious faiths, cultural entities, and communities at large. So that we can say the standardization of orthographies has been popular and socialized to Mozambique as a whole. We have our issues, but we have tried to minimize them through that inclusive process. And that standardization of those orthographies is one of the key elements that has made bilingual education be implemented in Mozambique, because right now, all the languages that have their orthographies standardized are being taught in schools. Our education system has two modalities. One monolingual taught in Portuguese, and I should mention that Portuguese is our official language following heritage from colonial rule. But we also have the bilingual education, which is in Portuguese and one of the African languages that is spoken in that particular area. Let me mention the triggers and phases of bilingual education, which is interesting. The main trigger for bilingual education is a pedagogical motivation. Starting with Martins in 1992 and several other studies that came forward highlighted the fact that there were higher rates of school wastage, which included absenteeism by children. They would leave home saying that they're going to school, but they will not reach a school. So there is a parent thinking that the child is at school, and there's a teacher thinking that the parent did not let the child go to school, but the child is somewhere in between home and school. And such levels of absenteeism, some were said to be because of the language of instruction Portuguese, which most children did not speak, particularly those in rural areas. And other aspects of school wastage include failure and dropout. So because of that, the government decided to experiment bilingual education in the country. The experimental program was PEBIMO, which ran from 1993 to 1997 in two provinces, one in southern Mozambique and Gaza, involving Xangana and Portuguese, and another in central Mozambique in Tete. The importance of the PEBIMO program was the fact that, well, the government wanted, the Ministry of Education in this case, wanted to see the potential of bilingual education. This program was evaluated by Benson. An external evaluation was carried out by Benson, and it showed the potential. Comparisons were made between this program and the monolingual one. The results were promising, and we'll talk about those results in a little while. But following the experimental program, there came a pilot program from 2003 to 2016. An important aspect of this pilot program is the fact that, if you like, it was hacked by the communities, in the sense that they started seeing their children evolving in schools, having good results, being happy, if you like. So where the government had not predicted, had not implemented the pilot program, the communities themselves either establish a bilingual school or asked for bilingual school. And so you can see what happened in the process. The fact that while the communities asked for more bilingual schools, the government had not predicted, so its resources ran out. So to some extent, while it was a good experience in the sense that the communities were involved, on the other hand, it was felt that it was it disrupted the piloting at some point. Following the pilot program in 2018, there came the full-fledged, or if you like, the institutionalized bilingual education program in the country, which coincided with the expansion of bilingual education, and right now we are on what we call expansion. It's an expansion that is felt or that has been recommended to be gradual, so that there will be control of the process, but you may also think that or see that that may not be possible at some points because the communities want it, and there are some issues with it, but it's gradual in that sense. At least that's what is defined. The model, excuse me, Barbara couldn't have been more specific when talking about the models here. Our model in Mozambique is a transition model, and we like to say that it's transition with some maintenance features. If you can look at the grid that I'm presenting there, you have all the school subjects, including Portuguese and an African language, mathematics, social science, natural science, arts and crafts, physical education, African. So you will see that from the time that the child gets in grade 1, they will have 8% of an African language and 20% of Portuguese. But by the time they reach grade 6, there will be some reverse in the sense that more exposure will be in Portuguese with 93% and less in the African language with about 7%. In grade 3, because it's gradual transition, in grade 3 starts transition, whereby in grades 1 and 2, the program envisages teaching of oral skills in Portuguese. Literacy, reading and writing in Portuguese starts in grade 3. So by the time we reach grade 4, some subjects that were taught in the L1 are taught now in Portuguese. Now, the important thing about the bilingual education in Mozambique is what we find to be the strengths. A study that we carried out, that one that Helen mentioned earlier, the light study, we found that there is high prioritization of the policy. And this is, just like Barbara was saying a while ago, there is some guarantee that at least within the next few years, disruptions to policy and to bilingual education may be minor. In terms of what I find to be opportunities, and going from evaluations that were carried out, some of which were international evaluations, there were high rates of school attendance, school retention, classroom participation, and slight improvement in learning outcomes. We also felt that the bilingual education helped language development through processes of harmonization of varieties and coinage. There were some socio-cultural gains whereby bilingual education is felt to create conditions for intergenerational communication, replicating linguistic practices in the community, and contributing to linguistic and cultural promotion and maintenance. And another opportunity is that bilingual education is contributing to some horizontal integrationist mobility, and this is very key in Mozambique because of what we call national unity. However, I would like to mention here, and this is my last slide, mention the challenges which are pressing the system. Teacher training, most, if not all, the teachers in the system teaching bilingual education were trained to teach monolingual education. To teach bilingual education, they have some in-service training short-term, and that's not enough. Materials development and supply is also an issue. Teacher deployment is an issue. And here with teacher deployment, I would like to highlight the teacher-student language match. Sometimes teachers that are in a given area are not native speakers of that language, even though we know that being a native speaker does not necessarily make you a good teacher. We also find elitist attitudes, particularly from the educated elites in the urban areas, who constantly, just like Barbara was saying, constantly question the validity and viability of bilingual education. There is also the concern by parents and communities over children's knowledge and performance in Portuguese, because Portuguese is the language of social mobility in the country. And there are transition issues. Though the transition happens fully in grade 6, how transition proceeds has been questioned by studies. And this is felt by the time that some subjects have to be taught in Portuguese, where there is over-reliance on code switching. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We're going to move straight to Helen, and hopefully we've requested for an additional 15 minutes so that we can also discuss assessments quickly and or go straight into the discussion. Please proceed, Helen. Okay, if Helen's not connected yet, then maybe we can go to Rolene and just discuss assessments. Rolene, if you can take 5 to 7 minutes, if possible, and then we can hopefully join us when she's available.
That would be fine, Josephine. So I'm Rolene Harold. Let me just put on my camera for a second. There you go. Okay, I'm Rolene Harold. I work at a research company and I specialize in assessment and psychometry. And I want to today just go through how assessment is linked to languages. And firstly, I want to agree with Barbara when she said that our language policy is very optimistic. We are making use of the early exit model where learners are doing, as Ingrid explained, are doing home language, are supposed to do home language in the first 3 years, and then they exit and do English. What happens on the ground, though, is not necessarily that, as Ingrid has explained. So I'm not going to go deeper into that. When it comes to assessment, though, there's 3 principles that are really important: fairness, reliability, and validity. So fairness literally means no child should be more advantaged in assessment than any other child. That is really difficult to attain in a country where we have 12 official languages, 11 languages, and then sign language is the 12th language. And where learners are sometimes in the African language speaking or medium school, but that is still not their home language. So then they are assumed to be, if they're in a isiZulu speaking school, they're assumed to be isiZulu speaking home language, but they might be Sesotho speaking. So when they do standardized tests, they are often provided with isiZulu assessments then. And obviously that is not fair towards them, even though they might have some language knowledge in isiZulu. The second one is reliability. You can't have reliability without fairness. Reliability is when you have consistency, not just within a test, how questions are answered, but also consistency across individuals in a sample. So when we talk about internal reliability, we're talking about different questions in the test should follow a logical pattern of probability of answering correctly. So like if you have a high probability of answering the difficult questions right, then you should have an even higher probability to answer the easy questions right. But sometimes you get questions that do the opposite. And they're supposed to be easy, but sometimes they're more difficult. And it's often when we do, it's something called differential item functionality test in ROSH, that we find that in certain languages, the language makes the item easier or more difficult. Like just an example, in some of our African languages, where you have a number that says +1, it would literally say, like if you have 6 + 1, then it would if you translate it into that language and then back translate it into English, you would literally say 6 or the number next, like after 6, or the next one after 6. So it's much easier for children because they just need to know the order of numbers. They don't need to have a cardinality understanding of what that number is. And then the last thing is validity. Validity just says you are really measuring what you are supposed to be measuring, and that the inferences you draw from your data are fair and reliable. So you can see, obviously, if you don't have reliability and fairness, you can't have validity. And if you have validity, then you have to make sure that this test is valid for everybody. So often, what they do in South Africa is they version tests. They don't translate tests because they know that different languages is at different stages of being standardized. So, and some languages don't have words for technical terms that are available in English, but in Afrikaans, but not in that language. So that African language. So what they do is they do versioning. It's like trying to use a qualitative measure to translate the questions into something that would be the same difficulty as the original English test. Now, in Afrikaans, it's rather easy because Afrikaans is highly standardized. But in English, it is, but you still have some problems with it. It's not perfect, but it's near perfect. With the African languages, it's really difficult. And because it relies on human beings doing this and guessing how difficult the question in the African language would be, that we find in often studies don't have big enough pilots to run diff analysis or differential item analysis or ROSH on the items to make sure that they are really equivalent. So like we often don't have enough learners in the sample to do that. So the standardized test gets done and we can't really say they're reliable or fair or valid until after the main study has happened, like the national systemics has happened. which is probably problematic. And then just the last thing, there's many things I want to say, but I'm going to restrict myself to just one last thing. It's not as straightforward as English and Afrikaans versus African languages, because our classes are often, for example, you will find a isiZulu class that have other speakers in the class. There might be one Ndebele speaker and 10 isiXhosa speakers, and so forth. So it's much more complicated and nuanced than just thinking about English versus the African languages. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to add one more thing. We also have a difference in difficulty levels of languages, because most of our African languages are transparent languages. So the sounds of the language map onto letters like almost 100%. For example, in isiZulu, there's only 37 phonemes or sounds, and there's 26 letters. So it's it maps really well onto the sounds maps really well onto the letters. But in English, that's obviously not possible. And our learners are required to learn English from grade R to grade 3 to such an extent that they can speak English, write English in grade 4 in all the other subjects. So that makes it really difficult to, and that's why there's a drop in assessment marks from grade 3 to grade 4. Or part of the reason is because they then suddenly required to know English really well, where English was taught only for an hour or 2 in a week in the first 3 grades. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Verlene, your presentation really does help us to understand the challenges and the implications of language on assessment as well. It partially explains the low results in learning assessments across South Africa and definitely across Africa. Helen, are you there? Can you give us an intervention for about 5 minutes so we can still open up for discussion, some discussion, if possible?
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to take very few minutes in view of the time already spent. I have listened to the various discussions around language of instruction in the various countries and the cases we've had, particularly from Mozambique. And one of my key takeaways in this forum is the place of what I call the 7 T's. Yes, this forum is focused specifically on language of instruction, but as I listened to the presentations, it dawned on me that there really are a confluence of factors that come to bear when you talk about language of instruction in any education system. Yes, as Barbara said, the policies have to be right. Those policies have to be those that support language of instruction. So in this case, the tongue that is used within the classroom, that's the first T. So yes, the policy have to be supportive. In a perfect world, having a maintenance approach, as is somewhat being done in Mozambique, would be the way to go to actually ensure our children are not only learning, but also benefiting from the education system. I know in the past, Barbara has talked about this language of instruction actually being like a gate that keeps some children out of the education system altogether, or it lets some in. And of course, we know in many contexts, in multilingual contexts, many children get locked out. So that gatekeeping function of language, really, there is a point for us to be able to interrogate that. But secondly, in terms of the second T, yes, you may have the language of instruction, but as was pointed out by Ingrid, the teachers what kinds of attitudes are the teachers coming into the classroom with? What are they actually doing in the classroom? Are they adhering to the policy as stipulated in the documents? So yes, the second T, focusing on the teachers really need the capacity to be able to actually enforce the language of instruction policy. And the third T focuses on the text. I think, again, it was alluded to. If you want to implement a bilingual education approach, what texts are you using? Are the children having the right text in their hands? Are they actually benefiting from the education, from the texts to support their development using the language of the catchment area, or depending on the language choice, all the languages? Do we have the resources to be able to put the right books in the children's hands? So that is the third T. The fourth T is in relation to time spent in the classroom. How much time? I think it was alluded to the fact that, yes, if the children, by Jo, when she said, you know, if the children are not speaking the language of instruction at home, it compromises their opportunity to be able to be better in that language and to do well in their academics. And so time on task, being able to learn in the target language, how much time are the children spending actually on task in the language of instruction that we want them to learn in. And in addition to that, we have the next T, which is talk. How much time is the teacher giving to classroom talk for the children to actually improve the opportunity to expand the space wherein children actually are learning in the target language? And the next T is in regards to, I have the importance of tracking. Tracking here, we've talked about the tests. Are the tests actually tracking the children, being able to determine whether or not they're learning in the language? And then the next one, how it is, the next T, how are we employing technology to help our children to actually learn? Given the language of instruction, are we able to employ technology? Are they able to know more information using the technology available to us? So, Jo, mine is to just put my weight behind the discussions we've had, but looking at the 7 T's, which are the tongue that is in focus in the classroom, the teachers, are they having the skills? Are they implementing the technology? The texts we are using, time on tasks, tracking the learners, and using the technology in classroom talk. I would like to stop there in view of the time. Thank you for listening to me.
Asanteni sana, Dr. Helen. That really summarized the conversation and the presentations well. I have nothing to add, just to thank the panelists for giving us such sort of engaging presentations. I would also like to now open it up for discussion. Please raise your hand if you want to speak, so that we can, and also clarify to who you're addressing the question. Also, while you're raising your hand, I will also look to see if there are any questions in the chat that we can start to address.
Jo, I see there's a question addressed to me in the chat. Should I take that one in the meantime?
Yes, please take that one.
Okie doke. Just a question for those who haven't seen it. I'll read it out. It was in response to my saying our teachers are, well, our classes are quite passive and learners are not speaking enough. And we do have some classes that are quite large. You are quite right, Mtokozizi, and but they're not all that large. So some of our classes, even in the rural areas, which are meant to be more crowded, are actually there 18, 24 kids in a class. Obviously, in very big classes, it's harder, but in all of our work with teachers, we do try to then help them to find alternative ways of engaging, which will still enable learners to speak, because they have to be more interactive and not as passive. I see 2 hands are up, so that's me for now.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that clarification. Rolene, you have a hand up, and who else has their hand up? Go ahead, Rolene.
Okay, so I just want to respond to Professor Henning's comment. To what extent that the policies in Africa invoke cognitive science, including some neuroscience evidence? In short, neuroscience supports late exit models, especially if you are exiting from an African language which is transparent and to English or another language like French, which is not transparent, it's opaque. So, so neuroscience definitely support rather exiting at grade 6, because opaque languages takes a much longer time to form the connections in your brain that's needed in order to read well. Then also that neuroscience also support bilingual or multilingual models. Your brain is actually develops certain stronger connections in certain areas, like Wernicke's area, for example. It develops stronger connections that and faster pathways the more languages you learn. And the sooner you start learning those languages, the younger you are, the more likely you are to make those connections and even have become so fully bilingual or multilingual that you can traverse between languages without even realizing you are. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolene. My apologies to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick one for Ingrid. Ingrid, you really alerted me to how we move from code switching to translanguaging. And if I may ask you something directly, do you think that the fluency of translanguaging can be researched in more detail than Lekete Makalela has done, for instance? I'm really looking forward to the future work that you'll be doing in your project. Thank you.
Thanks, Elvi, for the question. I mean, I work with Lekete at WIT, and I respect his work, and he's working more in the literacy domain than the math domain. So I think that's the first thing we need to put on the table. And so I think we are going to be taking things more deep in the math domain and looking at how we can harness the language and the translanguaging more for the teaching of math conceptually. So it's probably got a different focus to what Lekete's been doing, and thank you. I look forward to sharing this work with this community and others. Thanks for the interest in the work.
Thank you, Ingrid. I've seen that, Carlos, you also had your hand up.
Yes, I had my hand up, and it was a quick comment on Dr. Helen's, one of Dr. Helen's T's, that T for talk, as for experience in Mozambique. I think that is a very important element, because that's one of the differences between the monolingual program in Portuguese and the bilingual one, whereby teachers in Mozambique are used to teaching, and for them to teach is having them talking all the time. When they get into a bilingual education class, the children talk because they know the language, and at some point they also know the content from the one that they bring from home and they use in school. Just that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthews?
Hi, everyone. My question is to Barbara Krudel. I hope I pronounced it properly. In your presentation of the different language and education policy models on the African continent, I just want to hear, are there cases, or has there been a case where within one national context you have some kind of a hybrid, combination? where you have one model maybe for a particular region and another for another region, owing to the context? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Matthews, for the question. I think of two countries where that is the case. In the case of Ethiopia, which has a very strong local language medium policy, they leave it to the regions to decide which languages of instruction and also which grade, how far along they will use the local language. So a particular area of Ethiopia may decide they will use local language till grade 4, or they can decide grade 6, or they can decide grade 8. Those are the choices that are given in the national plan. So yes, that's an example of sort of national level. And you can see grade 4 is essentially early exit, and grade 8 is very late exit. And so they're substantially different. The other one I'm thinking of is more experimental or more sort of in process, and that's in Senegal, where the MOHEBs, the language and education framework, which is very strong on using local languages of instruction through grade 3, is sort of moving. I don't know if it's moving geographically or it's spreading across the country, but apparently there are options not to use it yet, but to stay with French. And in that case, as I understand it, the language policy in Senegal is quite supportive of local languages, but it doesn't require a lot of things. And so in that case, each area decides. I don't know if it's school by school or if it's province by province. I would have to know from someone else who works there, but they definitely have different options in different parts of the country. So those are two that I can think of.
Thank you, Barbara. One final question or comment to Helen.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to Ingrid's discussion around the translanguaging and the challenge I have seen in my country, Kenya, where, for example, the teachers will engage in translanguaging with the understanding and belief that it helps the children to understand and also access the academic content. But the disconnect comes in terms of the national examinations, which is required to be undertaken in only one language, English. And so, whereas it's helping the children, it ends up disadvantaging them because they are not allowed to translanguage when answering examination questions. So I think it's a dilemma, but like my team members have said here, we need to interrogate a little bit more of that. What can we do from an advocacy perspective in terms of advocating for more learner-friendly assessments that also speak to the language? And maybe that eats into what our colleague was talking in terms of assessments. Really, how can we package learning and assessment differently to benefit learners who may have gone through translanguaging? Yeah, that would be my input. Thank you.
So can I come in very briefly?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Ingrid.
Yes, thanks, Helen. You've pointed to a very, very important dilemma that does come up when the policy isn't fully supportive of the kind of language use that we're speaking about. So we are advocating for policy change, and Rolyn has on her side in the assessment also looked at that, and the idea of bilingual assessments and allowing learners to be more free in their use of the language is really, really important. But what we also do need is that learners do become fluent both in their mother tongue and in the language of instruction in the higher years if it changes from the mother tongue to English or whatever it might be. So yes, there are a lot of complex issues that still have to be overcome. And thanks for bringing that up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I would really just like to close by acknowledging the panelists and thanking them for sharing their research and being available on a Saturday. And we really hope to continue to partner with you as we advocate on this issue. To the attendees, thank you for the rich discussion, and we hope to stay engaged with you, and we hope that you will join us in the Born to Learn campaign. Thank you. And I think that the organizers of the conference have the final word. Is that correct, Kate?
Hi, Josephine. Yes, I would like to jump in very quickly to say a big thank you to you for moderating this wonderful panel so beautifully, and to all the panelists as well. Thank you so much for your contribution to the African Languages Conference. I would like to also thank all the attendees, everyone who came on and asked their questions live, and for their participation in the chat. Kate, thank you so much for working in the background with me to help coordinate this session. I appreciate your support, and to all the panelists.